I was very gradually building up a livelihood as a freelance interpreter. To some extent, I worked for the courts, I worked for the German Employment Agency, I worked for the public agency that is supposed to deal with asylum applications. It's changed its name now. And every now and then, as I said, I worked for the courts, and court proceedings are also held in this room 600 that you can see at the back here. Quite normal court proceedings. Every time I went along, I saw the old photographs and I could sense the atmosphere. So, of course, I developed an interest in it. The place that inspired me was number one, and number two was that more and more, as my career as a freelance conference interpreter gradually took off, or let's say gathered momentum, it really irritated me that so many people did not value the work at all. You'd be sitting there in the booth, giving your last, you'd have headaches for 2 days, and so forth, and nobody was interested. Nobody thought about what it means. And those two factors somehow flowed together, and I thought, you've got to tell people stories. They've got to learn about what we do, how we do it, and what it costs us. And then the history of these people who did something that was entirely groundbreaking, without which our profession would not exist today. But nobody knows nothing. And so I started. I read Geiber's book and so forth, and one thing led to another. In the meantime, the city of Nuremberg had also adopted a new attitude to processing its Nazi history. And for the first time, they set up this passageway, the Way of Human Rights, and set up a tiny little museum about the Nuremberg trials. And after this had been up and running for a year or two, I had a great deal to do with the woman who was running it. And we agreed, okay, let's do a series of events about interpreting back then and how it's developed, both in the international conference interpreting world, also in the international tribunals and the international courts. So we did that. You can check out the program on the website. That was in 2013. And for the very first event, when we were talking about these pioneers, in the foyer to the courtroom, that's room 600, we set up a mini exhibition with the very first version of these biographies on paper, which we printed out and attached to the cork notice boards. Of course, we couldn't afford to rent those notice boards, so the Federal Employment Agency, that's the public agency in Germany that does everything like placing people in jobs and career advice and so forth. I was also working for them quite a lot. They lent us these panels, and I don't think that the courts and the employment agency in Nuremberg have ever worked so closely together. When everything was over, I thought, well, we've done all this work in this working group that is mentioned over there on the panel. We have to carry on doing it. This is going to interest other people as well. So step by step by step, it grew. And the situation now, but this is certainly not the final state, is there are lots of open questions. A lot of things are not entirely conclusive, the information we have. We keep getting new input, so it's work in progress. It's a little bit difficult now for me to list everything. I mentioned that in 2013, that initial research resulted in a fairly primitive first version, and then we took those same pieces of paper and those same posters until they were torn to shreds and used them again, for example, at annual meetings of our association, AIK in Germany, in smaller groups. But really these were always insider events. And I think we can probably distinguish. We did a whole series of these insider shows, and we had some, like the Berlin exhibition in 2014, that were open to the entire general public, and like this one here in Ljubljana, where we have outsiders welcome to come in, and a lot of PR is being done to publicize what's going on here. We have to distinguish between those two types of event. For the UK association, we had a little exhibition too. I'll leave that out, because otherwise it would be too complicated. But a really big one with a public impact was a memorial event that we ran in the UK, in London, where they made that video with Mr. Ramler that you can see over there, where kindly Philip Sands was extremely committed to this work, and he did an interview with him on BBC and later wrote a very interesting article for The Guardian. This all had a public impact. And then the colleagues in Athens did a fantastic event in partnership with the Goethe Institute. In the middle of the crisis in Greece, when the colleagues from Athens came to me and said, "We want to do this," I said, "Can't you think of anything better?" They said, "No." That reaction reflects a lot of responses I've heard from other people who've run the exhibition, where they say it was a lot of work, but it was incredibly interesting. We learned a great deal, and we also learned to respect each other mutually, much better than in the past. And we learned that we're not only a team in the booth, but we have to be a team outside too, because we all have our own strengths and weaknesses, but together we're strong, which is a fantastic conclusion. So internally, this happened a great deal. Sometimes there were 3 or 4 people on the team, sometimes there were 10 or 20. But on the external side, I have observed that people who come into the exhibition who've either had something to do with interpreting in the past, or they've never had anything to do with interpreting, were utterly surprised about the content. Just imagine, the Nuremberg trials in international criminal law, in legal studies, there's masses of information, yards and yards, kilos and kilos of books, all about the Nuremberg trials. But not a syllable is devoted to these people. And this dimension is completely unknown. And that's why people are so impressed. You can see it in their faces when people walk around and start reading, how the penny drops, how they suddenly notice, oh, yes, of course. They wouldn't have understood each other. So gradually it became clear to people as they walked around the exhibition that without the work that these people were doing, none of this could have happened. That's one thing. And for another thing, they realized that it doesn't work without a lot of talent and a lot of personal commitment, integrity, audacity, endurance, concentration, and so forth. It's not enough just to know 2 languages. So, you can see in the statement by Stehr, for example, who was very much involved in the selection process, that this tiny little test that they did, which these days we would consider completely unprofessional, only 5% of people who took that test were even shortlisted to see whether they could interpret there or not. So I can see people learning, I can see that they're impressed, I can see that they're interested, and they have a completely different take then on interpreting and the people behind it. They become individuals with their own exciting histories, their own biographies, things they did in life. They're not just puppets or disembodied voices coming through a microphone. And that is what I wanted to achieve. That someone goes out of here and says, wow, those are amazing people. And especially these ones. Our plans for the future are, for one thing, that we want to carry on doing the research because we have a lot of clues, a lot of leads that we must follow up to ascertain more facts. I'm sure there would be a potential there to find some members of the family, children, grandchildren, so that we can find out more from them. And the second thing would be to identify more names. That's been the hardest thing so far. Over there is a list of all the names that we've found, and it also says there that theoretically there must be at least another 30 or 40 people who were involved during the trial. We don't have any trace of them, nothing, no names, nothing. If we could find some more, that would be fantastic, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of research and money. We don't have any money. We hope that increasingly we'll be able to find sponsors who'll help us so that we can continue with this research. If we can continue with the research, then we can write more interesting things on these panels and exhibit it. We have this panel approach now, which we're very satisfied with because it enables us to respond very flexibly to different kinds of space. You can set it up in different ways. You can tell a little bit here how it's been done. And that means that there are lots of places you can use for an exhibition like this. Something else we want to do is introduce a bit more diversity. We've got photographs. We're beginning to include a few artifacts, exhibits, items that add a bit of diversity and perhaps make it more interesting for the younger generation, because it's really important that the younger generation don't say, this is fusty old chestnut, not interested. They need to recognize why it's relevant, because it is extremely relevant, both for interpreters, but also for global politics, unfortunately. Because I am based in Nuremberg, I had a fantastic opportunity to get to know some of these people before they gradually all left us, apart from two. I got to know Miss Skunke in Nuremberg. I was able to interpret for her consecutively, and I must say it was pure pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And it was the first time that Miss Skunke had come back since the war, and she brought her husband. So the talks we had behind the scenes were really interesting, I can tell you, but you'd have to fill me for another 2 hours if I was going to tell you about that. I also got to know Mr. Sonnenfeld, who came to Nuremberg to give a series of talks and also to present his book, his autobiography. And he brought his huge family with him, right down to the grandchildren. So we were all sitting in room 600, and he's supposed to give a talk, and all of a sudden, they're sitting there on the benches, and someone says, this is the family, but they don't understand German. So all of a sudden, I find myself sitting among the Sonnenfeld family, interpreting, okay, fine, but it was a very interesting talk, so improvisation was possible. A very impressive man. Well, all the ones I got to know were very impressive. Very different people, but very impressive. And above all, this serenity, this calm. You might think they were torn or in despair or something, but no, these people had this calmness within themselves. I never got to know Mr. Jakubowicz. I've spoken to his granddaughter who wrote that book about him, and with him it was quite different. His response was quite different, and no doubt with some of the others too. But these two emanated this calmness. I also got to know Mr. Rammler. He was in Nuremberg too. He was also very interesting. It was good to talk to him. But I had the feeling that that experience as an interpreter in Nuremberg had been overlaid in the meantime by his many years as a career in the education sector. He's done a great deal for education. He ran and reformed a school, lived in Hawaii, had a great deal to do with Japan. His second wife was Japanese, and I looked after her while they were visiting Nuremberg. I think it was difficult for him to dig out the details, because although it was a very important episode in his life, it had kind of got buried by the other stuff over time. And also I had an opportunity a few years ago to talk to Mr. Less over the telephone. He lives in Albuquerque. He couldn't travel any longer, but at that point he was still pretty fit mentally. He'd written a few articles about the microphones they used, and I asked him questions about that and how it worked, and he said, you know, it's true, the photographs are a bit different. I can't really remember how exactly it worked in terms of the technical procedure, because as an interpreter, of course, I was interested to know how many buttons did you have and how did you react and did you get material to prepare with and all these things. But all these details from our everyday routine, they were buried in his mind. So from that point of view, he couldn't tell me a lot. But he was a very mild humanist. For many years in Chicago, he ran, I think, the Humanist Society. And that's how he was. He was the very incarnation of humanism. And I think that is so amazing. In spite of all those dreadful experiences, these people found their peace. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's really wonderful. So I'm delighted that I had the chance to get to know these people, even if it was only over the phone in some cases. But it was a tremendous privilege, because in the meantime, I wouldn't be able to speak to him over the phone anymore, and Mr. Rammler too. It looks as though, unfortunately, he's no longer able to speak to us. So we have to make sure that we can identify the next generation, the children, while we can, before everything is consigned to the past.